At 40 below zero, Alaska doesn't test you. It replaces the rules entirely. On December 21st, 1943, a routine test flight over the frozen interior went catastrophically wrong, forcing a young U.S. Army lieutenant to bail out alone into one of the most unforgiving landscapes on Earth. With no radio, no food, and winter closing in fast, his survival would depend on fire, discipline, and an unyielding refusal to give in to the cold, the silence, and the miles ahead. Crane was 24, a flight engineer by training, and like most young servicemen of that era, he carried a competence that looked from the outside like calm. His job was not romance and heroics. It was numbers, systems, tolerances. He monitored gauges, listened to the language of engines, and trusted the disciplined choreography of crew and machine. The mission out of Ladd Field near Fairbanks was listed as a cold-weather test flight, routine, almost bureaucratic. The war was consuming Europe and the Pacific, but the work in Alaska had its own urgency. Aircraft were being pushed into conditions that ruined lubricants, warped seals, froze control surfaces, and turned small failures into catastrophes. The crew was 5 men. They knew the air would be hostile, but they expected hostility in the abstract, something held back by aluminum skin, heated manifolds, and procedure. The Liberator climbed through brittle air to cruising altitude. At 25,000 feet, the world below flattened into an enormous white map. Rivers braided like veins. Black spruce rose in clusters so dense they looked like ink spilled across snow. It was the kind of landscape that deceived pilots because it offered no cues, no towns, no roads, no geometry to suggest scale. The interior could swallow a plane as neatly as it swallowed a man. Then the aircraft began to misbehave. At first, it was subtle, the sort of inconsistency that would make a conscientious engineer frown and double-check readings. A control response that lagged half a second longer than it should. A vibration that traveled through the airframe like a rumor. The Liberator wasn't a delicate machine. It was built to absorb punishment. But even a rugged bomber had an anatomy of failure, and once failure began, it could move quickly. The plane rolled, corrected, rolled again. The pilot fought it. Crane watched instruments and felt the shift from routine to emergency, the moment when procedure stops being a list and becomes a race. The bomber dropped into a flat spin, the most dreaded kind. Not a simple nose-down dive where gravity at least points in a comprehensible direction, but a horizontal rotation, the aircraft revolving like a coin on a table while losing altitude in a widening, sickening spiral. The horizon stopped behaving. A flat spin made a pilot feel as though the world had lost the right to be stable. Airspeed readings became misleading. Controls could go slack. To recover often required altitude they didn't have. The captain, John Sutherland, tried everything. Crane heard the tone of his voice change, heard the clipped urgency that meant fear was being held at bay with authority. At 8,000 feet, the calculation became brutal. The plane might be coaxed into a crash landing, but it might also carry them into the ground while still spinning. The captain ordered the crew to prepare to bail out. People romanticize parachutes as a kind of last-minute salvation. They imagine a calm jump, a drifting descent, maybe even a moment of beauty. In truth, stepping out of a failing aircraft is a wager made under pressure, and it is not made in comfort. When Crane moved toward the escape hatch, the air that pushed through the opening struck him like a solid force. The cold at altitude was not simply low temperature, it was predatory, instantly invasive. It burned his lungs, it snatched away moisture, it turned eyelashes into needles. Crane strapped on his chute, performed the movements he'd practiced, and reached the point where hesitation would be fatal. The others chose to remain with the aircraft, believing Sutherland might still wrestle it down. It was not cowardice or bravery on either side. It was competing assessments made in seconds. Crane took a breath that felt inadequate, as if the cold had stolen half the oxygen from the air. Then he jumped into emptiness and let gravity claim him. For a few seconds, there was only falling, a loud rush of air, and the animal knowledge that nothing separated him from the ground except silk and faith in a mechanism. When the parachute finally snapped open, it did so with violence, yanking his body upright, jerking straps into his shoulders, stealing another breath. The shock was clarifying. He was alive. He looked up once, an instinctive glance that meant nothing but comfort, and then down, because down was everything. Below him stretched an unbroken wilderness. Snow covered the country like a shroud. Spruce forests formed dark islands. A frozen river cut through the landscape, pale and wide. There were no roads, no buildings, no smoke, no human mark. It was the kind of view that looked clean from the air and murderous on the ground. The B-24 drifted away in the distance, carrying 4 men and every piece of equipment that would have made Crane's situation survivable in a conventional sense. The plane vanished into the white. The sound of engines faded, and with it the last sign of company. His landing was not graceful. He came down hard into deep snow, the impact driving air from his lungs and burying him to the waist. For a moment he couldn't move. The cold rose immediately through his boots and legs like water. When he finally forced himself upright, he stood in silence so complete it felt staged. The only sound was the faint movement of parachute fabric in the wind. It was already afternoon. In late December, daylight in Alaska is stingy. The sun makes a low arc, never gaining the warmth of height. The winter solstice had just passed. He had hours, maybe fewer, before darkness would drop and the temperature would fall even further. The Arctic did not offer a gentle night. It delivered a long, hard one. Crane took stock of what he had and what he didn't, with the practiced clarity of someone trained to inventory resources in crisis. He had a small Boy Scout knife. He had a box of waterproof matches. He had the clothes on his body, uniform, boots, gloves, and he had the parachute, a tangle of silk and nylon and cord. He had no food, no compass, no radio, no signal flares, no sleeping bag. He had no certainty of direction. The nearest settlement was not near in any human sense. It was an idea. Many men would have died that first night without making a single heroic mistake. Exposure kills quietly. It begins with shivering, then numbness, then the kind of fatigue that feels like relief. The temptation is to sit down, to stop fighting the cold and let the body do what it wants. Crane understood enough about hypothermia to fear that temptation. He also understood that a person alone in that environment didn't get to be sentimental about discomfort. He needed shelter immediately, not tomorrow, not after he rested, not after he figured out a plan. Shelter was the plan. He gathered the parachute and wrapped it around himself, turning silk into insulation. It was thin and inadequate compared to proper gear, but it trapped air and reduced heat loss. He burrowed into the snow, using drift and depression as protection from wind. The fabric made a crude cocoon. The snow itself helped. Snow insulates when you're inside it, not when you're on top of it. He lay there as the sky darkened, listening to the interior grow colder. In the distance, wolves howled. Not close enough to be immediate danger, but near enough to remind him that he was not the only creature hungry in this place. Sleep came in fragments. His body shook with violent shivers that spent calories like gasoline. He woke repeatedly, disoriented, unsure for a moment where he was, then remembering with a surge of dread. Breath iced his beard. The fabric stiffened as moisture froze. He fought the urge to lie still too long. By morning, His extremities were already threatened. Fingers felt clumsy. Toes were numb, as if his feet belonged to someone else. Frostbite doesn't arrive like a dramatic injury. It creeps in, a quiet theft. Crane knew he needed fire, not for comfort, but for circulation, for survival, for the ability to use his hands. The matches in his pocket suddenly carried the weight of life itself. In that country, fire is not merely warmth. Fire is permission. The first match died in wind the moment he struck it. The second flared and vanished. The third did the same. 3 small failures, but each one felt larger because it cost him what he couldn't replace. Panic began to press at the edges of his mind, not screaming panic, but a tightening, a sense of time closing in. If he wasted the matches, he would be reduced to primitive friction methods in sub-zero cold with numb hands, a nearly impossible task. The world would not give him another try. On the 4th attempt, he forced himself to slow down. He looked for shelter from wind. He dug beneath a fallen spruce where branches had created a pocket of relative dryness. He scraped bark, shaved wood into thin curls, built a small nest of tinder. He used his body as a windbreak, crouched low, and struck the match with deliberate care. This time, the flame caught the fine shavings and clung there, trembling, then strengthening as he fed it. When the fire finally stabilized into something more than a fragile flicker, Crane felt a surge of relief so intense it was nearly dizzying. Heat returned to his fingers with pain, a stabbing sensation that meant blood was moving again. He held his hands near the flames and made a quiet decision that mattered more than any plan. He would not die there. For the next days, he lived on melted snow. Hunger didn't announce itself at first. It began as an emptiness, then grew into a constant ache. In normal conditions, a man can go weeks without food. In the Arctic, hunger is amplified because the cold demands energy. Every movement burns calories. Every shiver is a tax. Crane's stomach cramped. His thoughts sometimes narrowed into an obsessive focus on food, as if the mind itself were trying to drag him towards survival by force of desire. He fashioned snares from parachute cord, using knowledge that came from long ago, Boy Scout lessons, small skills learned in childhood and forgotten until the moment they become the only currency that matters. He set crude traps along likely rabbit runs, trying to place them where they would not be obvious, where snowshoe hares might pass without noticing. His first attempts failed. Some were clumsy, set too high or too loose. Others were placed where no animal traveled. Each day he checked them, with diminishing hope, because hope itself costs energy if it keeps you moving toward disappointment. On the 4th day, he found a snowshoe hare caught by the hind leg. It was small, frightened, struggling. Crane killed it quickly, not out of mercy alone, but because the longer it fought, the more likely it would break free. With numb fingers, he skinned it, cleaned it, cooked it over his careful fire. The smell of meat, thin and wild, hit him with an intensity that felt almost obscene. He ate slowly, aware that if he ate too fast, he might get sick, but unable to prevent a kind of reverence. It wasn't a feast. It was simply enough. Enough to keep the engine running. For a week, he stayed near his landing area, because the logic of rescue still tugged at him. If the military mounted a search, they would look for him there first. He spread bright parachute fabric across the snow in an attempt to make himself visible from above. He built smoky fires during the day, feeding them green boughs to create a signal plume. He scanned the sky until his neck ached. He listened for engines until the silence itself felt insulting. No aircraft came. The Alaskan interior is vast in a way that makes search and rescue a gamble. A man on the ground is small. Snow and forest erase color. Wind smears tracks. Without a radio, without coordinates, without a clear crash site, search becomes a word that describes intention more than outcome. Crane began to understand that even if someone was looking, they might never find him. The landscape was too large, and he was only one body in it. At some point, he could not later say exactly when, the hope of rescue turned from a reasonable expectation into a fantasy. That was not a dramatic moment. It was an internal shift, a quiet acknowledgement. And once it happened, it freed him in a grim way. If no one was coming, then he had only one option. He had to leave. He chose the river because rivers are the simplest logic in wilderness. Water collects, water moves, people tend to gather near it, and trails often follow it. Even frozen, a river is a line through chaos. Crane climbed to a low ridge, studied the country, and began walking downstream. Travel in deep snow is grinding work. Each step requires lifting the foot high, then driving it down, breaking crust, dragging forward. In that cold, sweat is dangerous because wet clothing steals heat fast. But moving without sweating requires a controlled pace, which is hard when fear urges haste. Crane learned to walk like a machine, steady, deliberate, conserving energy. When he stopped, he built fire. When he slept near fire, waking repeatedly to feed it. His days became a cycle of movement and maintenance. Gather wood, melt snow, check snares, walk, rebuild shelter, survive the night. By day 20, he had lost nearly 30 pounds. His uniform hung looser. His face cracked and bled at the corners of his mouth. His beard grew thick, providing a little insulation, but also collecting ice from his breath until it felt like he wore a mask. He developed a kind of economy of motion. No wasted gestures, no sudden movements, no unnecessary detours, because every flourish cost him warmth and calories. The isolation began to do what isolation always does. It did not merely make him lonely, it altered his mind's relationship to reality. Humans are social animals. We calibrate ourselves through other voices. Alone for long enough, a person's thoughts begin to echo, and the echo becomes its own company. Crane began talking aloud. At first it was practical, reciting procedures, reminding himself of steps, giving himself orders the way an officer would. Later it became conversational. He spoke to animals he saw, to trees, to the river, to nothing. It wasn't insanity so much as adaptation, the mind inventing companionship to keep itself organized. In a place where death could arrive because you made one tired, stupid mistake, mental clarity was as vital as fire. Nights were the hardest. The temperature dropped further. The darkness stretched. Sometimes the aurora rippled overhead, a green, shifting veil that looked almost artificial, too graceful for such a brutal world. It could be comforting, the suggestion that beauty existed even here. It could also be unsettling, like the sky itself was alive and watching. Crane lay wrapped in parachute fabric or crude shelters, listening to the wind and the occasional crack of ice. Around day 35, the river reminded him how quickly conditions could shift from hardship to immediate danger. Crossing what seemed like solid ice, he felt the surface give, and then he was plunged into freezing water up to his waist. The shock was so intense it stole his ability to think for a second. Cold water does that. It triggers a reflex that can drown you if your head goes under, because the body wants to gasp. Crane fought for the ice edge, but it broke away as he grabbed it. He drove his knife into the ice like a pick, dragging himself out inch by inch. Wet clothing at 40 below is not an inconvenience. It is a countdown. In minutes, his pants began to freeze solid, the fabric turning stiff as wood. He stumbled to shore, gathered wood with frantic urgency, built the largest fire he could manage. He stripped off the frozen clothes, sitting exposed in the Arctic, close enough to the flames that heat stung his skin. He watched steam rise from his trousers and understood with cold clarity that if the fire failed before the fabric dried, he would die. That moment, naked, shaking, guarding a fire like a sacred object, etched itself into his memory as the purest form of fear. Fear without enemy, without noise, without anything to fight except time and physics. He lived through that day and the days that followed, but his body was changing. Fat reserves vanished. Then muscle began to go. He grew gaunt. Hunger never left. It only changed texture, from acute pain to a steady emptiness. He learned to trap more effectively, to read animal sign, to find places where rabbits and other small game moved. Sometimes he ate well enough to feel temporarily human again. Other times he went days with little, and the world narrowed to the next fire, the next mile, the next chance. He also learned the rules of wood. Some trees burned hot, some burned slow, some sparked and died. In a land where fire was life, knowledge of fuel mattered. He learned to find dry wood under snow, to split dead branches, to keep embers alive through the night by burying them in ash and insulating them. He began sleeping in short intervals, waking to feed the stove of his own survival before his body could slip too far into cold. Then, around day 50, the wilderness offered a rare mercy, evidence of humans. It was not a distant sound or a hopeful mirage. It was geometry, straight lines where nature preferred curves. A small log cabin stood among the trees, weathered and silent. For several seconds, Crane simply stared at it, afraid it might dissolve if he approached, afraid his mind had invented it as a cruel trick. But the cabin held its shape. It was real. Inside, dust lay thick, undisturbed. But the place contained treasure: a rusty stove, a cache of matches, a can of lard, tins of food, a knife better than his own, and, most importantly, a .22 rifle with ammunition. Crane's reaction was not triumph. It was release. He sat down and cried, the way men sometimes cry when they've been strong too long, not because they're suddenly weak, but because the pressure finally finds a seam. He stayed there for a while, days, maybe weeks, recovering strength. He ate carefully, knowing his stomach could not handle abundance after long deprivation. He used the rifle to hunt small game more efficiently, conserving energy that would have been spent on traps. He warmed himself with the stove until his bones felt less like glass. He searched the cabin and found an old map, faded and not entirely reliable, but enough to offer something he hadn't had in a long time: orientation. The map suggested he was deep in the upper reaches of the Yukon country, far from major settlements, but not utterly beyond the reach of humans. There were outposts downstream, trading posts, camps. Names on paper meant possibility. When he finally left the cabin, he did so with better tools and a new kind of determination. He fashioned crude snowshoes from wood and hide, built a small sled to drag supplies rather than carry them. Travel became marginally less punishing, but the wilderness remained what it was: storms that trapped him for days, dense forest that forced detours, ravines that required exhausting climbs, ice that demanded constant caution. He was still alone. He was still thin. But he had proof that humans existed out here, that the land was not an unbroken void. By day 70, he had covered well over 100 miles. His body was a ledger of loss. His mind fought a constant battle between hope and exhaustion. He managed the scale of the journey the only way anyone manages something too large to comprehend. He reduced it. Not hundreds of miles, just the next bend in the river, the next patch of dry wood, the next night survived. He developed a rhythm: move, rest, survive, repeated until it became less a mantra than a mechanical truth. On day 84, the wilderness offered another form of geometry: tracks, not animal tracks, those he had learned to read as casually as a city man reads street signs, but human tracks, recent, sharp-edged, purposeful. For a moment he stood still, afraid to breathe, afraid the evidence would vanish. Then he followed. The tracks led to a bend in the river, and beyond it he saw smoke rising. A small camp sat in the trees, and around it were people, Athabascan trappers, living with the competence of those who understood this land not as a hostile mystery, but as home. Crane approached slowly. He must have looked like something dredged from a nightmare, skeletal, bearded, wearing a mixture of tattered uniform and improvised clothing, eyes bright with a desperation that can frighten even kind people. He called out. His voice cracked, raw from disuse. The trappers, startled at first, anyone would, but they recognized immediately what he was, a man at the edge. They brought him in, fed him, warmed him. In that first moment of human contact, Crane's control broke. He cried openly, not because he wanted to, but because the body sometimes releases emotion the way it releases shivers. After so long alone, the presence of other people felt unreal, like waking from a fever dream into a room with light. They kept him for days, helping him regain enough strength to travel. Then they moved him by dog sled to the nearest trading post, where arrangements could be made to get him back to the world of hospitals and paperwork and disbelief. When Crane arrived in Fairbanks, medical staff were stunned by the numbers. He had dropped from around 180 pounds to 115. Frostbite marked him, but remarkably, he had not lost fingers or toes. Malnutrition had thinned him, weakened him, caused hair loss and deficiencies that would take months to correct. Yet he was alive. Alive after nearly 3 months alone in conditions that kill quickly and without fanfare. News of his survival traveled fast. People love stories that make the human body seem heroic, that frame endurance as a kind of victory over nature. But the truth of Crane's ordeal was less romantic and more instructive. He survived not because the wilderness softened, and not because he was blessed by luck alone, but because he did a series of small, correct things under pressure, when doing the wrong thing would have been easier. He built shelter immediately. He guarded fire like a sacred duty. He conserved matches. He ate what he could and didn't waste energy pretending hunger didn't matter. He moved when staying still became a slow death. He managed his mind the way he managed his body, by imposing structure, by refusing to let despair become a decision. Military officials interviewed him for what they could learn. The Arctic was not forgiving of ignorance, and men were going to keep flying over it. Crane's experience, brutal as it was, became a kind of field manual, written in scars and memory. After he recovered, he returned to duty. He was offered a discharge and refused it. When asked why, he answered with a logic that sounded almost casual, as if he were discussing odds on paper. Lightning doesn't strike twice. Later, back in civilian life in Philadelphia, he rarely spoke about it. He married, had children, worked as an engineer, built a life that extended far beyond those 84 days. When pressed, he downplayed what he'd done, the way many from his generation did. They did not think of endurance as exceptional. They thought of it as necessary. But the story persisted because it carried a fundamental lesson. In the most unforgiving places, survival is not a single heroic act. It is a long chain of decisions, each one small, each one made under fatigue and fear, each one a refusal to surrender. Somewhere along the Charlie River, the wreckage of the Liberator still lies scattered across tundra and trees, a broken monument to a flight that began like paperwork and ended like myth. The other 4 men were never recovered. Their names exist in records and family stories, and the quiet grief of a war that scattered loss across the world. In 1991, decades after the crash, the remains were located and documented. The artifact of a watch frozen at the time the aircraft met the ground, a small mechanical witness to the moment gravity finished the argument. Crane lived until 2002. He reached 83. That fact, more than anything, is the real measure of what happened out there. The wilderness tried to reduce him to a footnote, and he refused. He did not defeat Alaska. No one defeats a place like that. He simply endured it long enough to reach other people, to step back into the human world, and to keep living. And if you strip away the romance and the retelling, what remains is the quiet truth at the center of the story. The truth Crane himself pointed to whenever someone tried to call him a hero. The moment you decide you're going to die, you do. He never made that decision.
If this story stayed with you, if it made you think about what humans are capable of when everything familiar is stripped away, consider supporting the channel. Like the video, subscribe for more true stories of survival, endurance, and the limits of the human spirit. And share it with someone who appreciates real stories that deserve to be remembered.